Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I'm happy to go on this journey with you. These past few weeks have been some of the most pivotal in Israel's modern history with Lebanon. On October 8th, Hezbollah initiated attacks on Israel's northern front, attempting to divert Israeli forces from the military operations in Gaza. Since the onset of the war, Hezbollah has persistently tied any ceasefire in Gaza to a ceasefire on the northern border. The consequences of this conflict have been significant. Around 68,000 Israelis from the north have been displaced, while in Lebanon, the UN reports on October 10th that perhaps 600,000 have been displaced from their homes due to the fighting. Israel's intelligence and operational successes have dealt devastating blows to Hezbollah's leadership. In September, an Israeli operation saw thousands of Hezbollah-affiliated pagers detonate across Lebanon in an unprecedented intelligence breach. Following this, Israel successfully eliminated a significant portion of Hezbollah's senior command, including its infamous leader Hassan Nasrallah and later his successor. U.S. President Joe Biden expressed satisfaction with the strike, calling it, quote, a measure of justice, and noted how many Americans have been killed by Hezbollah, mentioning Lebanese and Israelis as well. Israel thus sees this moment as an opportunity to capitalize on Hezbollah's current weakness to restore a baseline of security for its citizens in the north who have been displaced since the beginning of the war. To this end, Israel has begun ground operations in southern Lebanon, which have been described by the IDF as, quote, limited, localized, and targeted raids, with the goal of demolishing Hezbollah's infrastructure in the border area. Despite the decapitation of Hezbollah's senior command, it continues to fire rockets in Israel. Iran, Hezbollah's main backer, retaliated against the killing both of Nasrallah and Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh by launching approximately 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, all within an hour, and Israel is the size of New Jersey. Israel, for its part, sees this as a critical moment to reshape the region and to secure its borders, both in the north and in the south. Unfortunately, the violence is far from over. Today, I'm joined by two experts to help us unpack what Israel's recent operational successes mean for Hezbollah and the future of the Lebanese state and beyond. Hanin is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute. Hanin, a longtime managing editor of Lebanon's Now News website, has written extensively on key issues such as Hezbollah's role in Lebanon's political system and Iran's growing influence in the region. Before joining Now, she wrote for several Lebanese newspapers and worked as a researcher for the UN Development Program. I will also be joined by Matt Levitt. He's the director of the Counterterrorism and Intelligence program at the Washington Institute. He has held key roles in the U.S. government, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of the Treasury and a counterterrorism advisor at the State Department. He's the host of a podcast series himself called Breaking Hezbollah's Golden Rule, and he just released an updated version of his book, Hezbollah, The Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God, an examination of Hezbollah's covert activities outside Lebanon. I'm going to be having a conversation first with Hanin and then with Matt. Hanin, welcome to Decision Points.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's great to have you, and I really am hoping you can help guide us. These seem to be extraordinary days in Lebanon, given all that's gone on between Israel and Hezbollah, the involvement of Iran. And this episode, we really want to channel your expertise and also of a colleague, Matt Levitt, who's written a book recently on Hezbollah, to challenge the two of us, to channel your expertise. So if you just had to say big picture, how badly has Hezbollah been hurt by everything starting from the pagers, the walkie-talkies, what looks like a decapitation of the top tier of their leadership, Israel now doing an incursion in southern Lebanon as we tape this? What does this mean for the organization? Is it the same Hezbollah as we've known it all these years?
Yeah, this is one of the big questions today, which is also part of the other question is what is the goal of Israel in this operation, this military operation in Lebanon, how this war will end. It seems that Israel is not going to stop before they reach this conclusion in Lebanon, that Hezbollah is no longer a threat to Israel. So yes, in that sense, we see more and more of Hezbollah's weakening. Their military power is definitely no longer efficient. They're still firing missiles at Israel, that's true, but Israel is not done with them. So by the time Israel is done, probably their capability of threatening Israel with missiles will no longer be efficient. Today, do they still have missiles, long-term missiles, precision-guided missiles? Yes, they do. Can they use them? Not really. Because what they're doing today is they're launching short-range missiles at Israel, definitely not ones that can hit Tel Aviv or precise equipment, because there are two layers to that. One is that Israel is still bombing Hezbollah to actually launch these missiles, the big ones. They cannot just launch them. They need to move them, put them on trucks, move the trucks, calibrate them, and by the time of moving them and launching them, Israel will bomb every single attempt. And the other thing is that these precision-guided missiles are not Hezbollah's. They are Iran's insurance policy. Iran decides when and how and who will use these missiles. This is another layer that Hezbollah cannot really change. However, a lot of people in Lebanon, everybody that I talk to say the same thing, that by the time Israel is done with this war, what we will have is that a very weak Hezbollah in the sense that it will no longer be a serious threat to Israel. That's true. Israel will be able to stop at one point and say to its residents in the north that they can go back home. It will help them reconstruct. It will help them go back and it will help them feel safe. However, this war, although it has mitigated Hezbollah in that sense, it will not end Hezbollah's power inside Lebanon. Because what the Lebanese feel is that this war is to safeguard Israel. This war is not to change actually things in Lebanon. So unless certain things can be done, and I've written about it, and we can talk more about what are the opportunities here to make sure that this war is beneficial for both the Israelis and the Lebanese people, because otherwise Hezbollah will crumble. The version like 2.0 of Hezbollah, it will crumble into street gangs and militias. We will have more IRGC, Quds Force, hands-on approach inside Lebanon to train and appoint the new class of commandment. So this is basically the scenario that everybody is expecting. The opportunities, again, are missed.
So how do you ensure that the devastating blows Hezbollah has suffered, it doesn't recover from? And listening to you, like when you talk about people having a hard time taking launchers from place to place, is this just a problem of the right commanders coordinating among themselves? Is it a question of the motivation of the people? Is it a technical inability for them to do it? I mean, is this something they recover from in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Or this is something that is a much deeper problem?
It is definitely a much deeper problem. So let's list the things that they have lost and if they can come back from it or not. Military capabilities, missiles, factories, the weapons depots, yes, they've lost a lot and they will lose much more. Can they come back from this? They can if Iran replaces everything they have. The problem is that Iran is not in a position to replace everything. Iran is not in a position to do this all at once. Again, Iran has its own financial and internal issues, and replacing all these missiles all at once is a lot. So it will take time, a lot of time. The other thing that they lost is their communication system. To reestablish this communication system is not really a big deal, but they have an issue of trust because, at the end of the day, sanctions do not work in the sense of making sure that they don't have the finances, that they can't buy stuff. What sanctions did is that forced Iran and Hezbollah to buy the pagers and the walkie-talkies and the communication system from sources that are not credible. And this is how Israel was able to infiltrate and sell them the pagers themselves. And it worked. And this is because of the sanctions, basically. This is how sanctions work. And to do this, again, there is a big chance that they're going to risk it. Are they really be able to rebuild their communication system? They don't trust anything they use. They don't trust technology. They don't use their phones anymore. They don't use, of course, obviously the pagers and walkie-talkies. They don't use their computers because this is what we know. We know that the pagers have been infiltrated.
And by the way, the fact that they didn't have that communication meant they had to meet in person, the Radwan people.
Exactly.
And that's what enabled Israel to hit them.
Nasrallah and Hashim Safiuddin couldn't speak to their people, so they met in person, and that's how Israel got them. But the most important thing that they lost their legitimacy. This is something they cannot come back from. And this is very important. They've always told the Lebanese, especially the Shia community in Lebanon, that our weapons will protect you. Nothing will happen to you as long as you're around. We make these decisions in order to protect you. Today, every Shia sleeping in the street or displaced, which is basically every single Shia.
Every Shia where? In Beirut, because they live in the Dakhia area, also in southern Lebanon?
Everyone. I lived in Beirut, but I had family in the south. It's not just about you. It's about your family. It's about your friends. It's about everything. Every Shia today is looking at this. And if you're not brainwashed, and the brainwashed people are few, there are not a lot of brainwashed people, because not Shia relationship to Hezbollah is not ideological. It's much more complicated than that. So they're looking at Hezbollah and they're saying, your arms actually did nothing but brought us destruction. And we did not want that. They knew that the Shia did not want that, and they still did it. Today, they lost the legitimacy of their arms. Their arms are no longer a tool to protect the Lebanese and Lebanon. Their arms today are a tool for destruction. And this they cannot come back from. Their constituency is important to them. They cannot really survive without the Shia support, and they lost.
I mean, you who've been a student of Hezbollah for so many years, when Naim Qassem, some people have thought of him as like the right-hand person. He's not a military guy, but the right-hand person of Nasrallah. When he says publicly, basically calling for an unconditional ceasefire, this is a very big deal, isn't it?
It's a very big deal. They are weak. This is a sign of they retreated from their original position of coupling. Basically, what he said is that we agree to decouple the two fronts and we agree to ceasefire. Just do it now, because they know that if Israel stops now, they can come back from this. But they know if Israel continues, they will not be able to come back from this. And the most important thing here, there are a lot of indications that they have actually lost major parts of their bank as well, Qard al-Hassan, which means that if they don't have the money for the depositors, if they don't have money for salaries, if they don't have money for social services, there's no way you can come back from this. And the bags of dollars that they've been accumulating over the years, if they burned in Dahi and some of these explosions, not only they don't have money, the depositors that trusted them with their money are going to take the rest of Hezbollah, take on their whatever is left with Hezbollah. This is more important for them than whatever rhetoric, resistant rhetoric. However, one thing here I want to say, they lost their legitimacy of their arms. But it's very important for Israel to understand that this incursion in South Lebanon, no matter how important it is, it does not turn into an occupation. Because the moment it turns into an occupation, Hezbollah will be able to regain the legitimacy of their arms.
That was exactly my next question, which is, how do you make sure that this is seen as a war against Hezbollah and not against the people of Lebanon? And Israel is facing a kind of catch-22, which is, right now, let's say there's a vacuum. So Israel says, look, if Israel doesn't clean out all the launchers and rockets, we can't get 68,000 people back to their homes. Got it. But at the same time, Israel does not want to occupy another country. It learned that having a security zone in 1985 to 2000 did not stop rocket attacks. People fired them then over the security zone. So it's not a guarantee yet. But until the Lebanese armed forces has teeth, I don't know how Israel's going to just take a leap into the dark to say, well, it'll somehow work out. And the longer they stay, the more Hezbollah is going to be able to say to the Lebanese people, aha, you see, this is about annexation, occupation, whatever word you want to use. Of course, they would never annex it, but it's about occupation, and this is against you, not just against me. How does Israel keep the distinction between these two things, to say it's about Hezbollah, it's not about the Lebanese people? Because they'll say, look, we're displaced. There's been a lot of damage. I was on a Zoom with someone from Beirut yesterday and was talking about a lot of damage. So how do you keep the focus that this is not a war against the Lebanese people?
I think a lot of it is clear. I was in Lebanon in 2006, and before I grew up in Lebanon. In 2006, I was in Beirut, but my family was in the south, and they were trapped. We were trapped in Lebanon. We couldn't go. You could only leave if you have a foreign passport and your country can actually evacuate you. First thing the Israelis did in 2006 was hit the airport and hit the highways, the bridges, everything. It was a war on Lebanon, not on Hezbollah. And people were trapped. People couldn't leave. Refugees couldn't make it. Very few people made it. This time is different, very different. From the very beginning, Israel is telling everyone in Lebanon that this is a war on Hezbollah. If you don't want to be killed, stay away from these areas. And of course, it's not easy to stay away because the only option sometimes is to live in the street. And some people prefer to die in dignity rather than live in the streets. So it's not an easy choice to make. That's why you still see a lot of people dying, actually, every time Israel hits Dahi.
Dahi, again, is the Hezbollah neighborhood in Beirut, for those who don't know.
Hezbollah stronghold in the suburbs of Beirut. This time is different because the airport is still working. Israel did not hit the airport. Israel did not hit the highways or the bridges. No one is really trapped. It's clear this time that people can actually leave the south, Dahi, the Bekaa, and they can actually leave Lebanon if they can afford it.
Can they go to northern Lebanon? That hasn't really been hit.
Yeah. They can go to North Lebanon. A lot of people are going to Syria, but not many. Hezbollah's people, like their own very, circle, Hezbollah's circle, community circles, its fighters, its members, and their families, they're taking them to Iraq. So they're moving to Syria.
That is remarkable. Syria, a country that's been devastated by war, civil war for all these years, you're saying the people feel safer going to Syria.
Well, the Hezbollah community is safer in Syria, but they're not staying in Syria. They're putting them in buses the next day, and they're sending them to Iraq, to the Ala provinces, to other areas where the Hashd al-Shabi, the Iran militias in Iraq are strong. They're taking them in. It's clear that this is not 2006, and it's clear that this is a war on Hezbollah. It's not a war on Lebanon, but people have two concerns. One is that the incursion doesn't turn into an occupation. This messaging is extremely important. And two, the uncertainty of what's going to happen to us after Israel secures its border or mitigates Hezbollah. What about us? Is Hezbollah going to turn against us then? This is the main question.
By the way, I think it's important for our listeners to know that this is different than Gaza. Egypt will not take any Gazans. Jordan will not take Gazans. This is more of a classic humanitarian situation where if people are not in the immediate area of Hezbollah, they could leave elsewhere. They're not stuck the way they are in Gaza.
Yes and no. They're not stuck. People can leave. People have left. There are some areas that are not taking in any refugees, even to the streets, but that's more of a sectarian thing, internal sectarian tension in Lebanon that is on the rise, actually, because they're afraid that among these refugees, there are Hezbollah members that are going to be bombed by Israel. And it happened. A lot of these people were taken in certain areas, refugees who had no idea that in the same building there was a Hezbollah member. And the refugees themselves had no idea there was a Hezbollah member among them. And Israel hit a building in Ain al-Dilib, which is a Christian area. There were some people from the south living in it. They died. They went to Ain al-Dilib, took refuge in a Christian town, and then had no idea that in the same building there was also a Hezbollah member. Israel hit the building. Half of the people died. But this happened. Not every time. So I'm saying, it is safe mostly to go to other areas. But there are two problems here is that you don't know who is coming with you to that building. And the people in these areas, because of these things that are happening, they don't want to rent the Shia anymore. So it's becoming a serious fear among the other Lebanese communities of taking in the Shia. That's why you see a lot of people in the streets.
Okay, so we talked about Hezbollah and the blow that it suffered. We've talked about the people of Lebanon. Now, the government of Lebanon is the third area I wanted to raise with you, which is, it just seems that, and we talked about this in our last episode together when we spoke, you, me, and Amos Harel, that the Mideast is unique in a certain way, that the non-state actors have been stronger than the state. You've had weak states that have been hollowed out by Iran. And now the question is, how do you right-size things? How do you empower the states so they gain back control of their country and they're not at the mercy of Iran or Hezbollah and can actually exert their sovereignty. For example, the president of Lebanon, it's a position that's been vacant for 2 years. Do you think there's a way, with maybe leadership by the French and the U.S., but maybe the U.S. not being at the front because of optics in Lebanon, to help have a presidency and have institutions that are stronger, including a stronger LAF, that's the Lebanese Armed Forces, that could actually deploy, which is what 1701 was supposed to be about after the last war of 2006, to deploy in the south, to deploy along the Syrian-Lebanese border with UNIFIL, and to ensure that Hezbollah cannot reconstitute itself. And 1559, another Security Council resolution, actually called for the dismantlement of militias. How do you seize on this moment so Lebanon can take back its country, and that would be viewed as legitimate in the eyes of the Lebanese, so that the country has a chance and it is no longer at the mercy of Hezbollah and Iran?
This is actually what I'm focusing on right now. I just finished a piece on that called The Roadmap for Enduring Ceasefire in Lebanon. And I think there is an opportunity. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but I'm proposing a roadmap. That roadmap, if not taken, the alternative is going to be much worse. You have to try. You have to give it a shot and see what happens. And then you will have something at least better than what we have now. Today, what we're seeing is that there's an inefficient pro-Hezbollah government, Speaker of the Parliament, acting Prime Minister, no president, that will do anything to maintain the status quo so they can make sure that Hezbollah comes back to something that is friendly. This is what they're doing now. They're not allowing the parliament to convene to elect a president so they can, form a new government, a new security system, etc. They're not allowing the army to deploy and impose law and order. And they're not allowing anything to change, despite the sectarian violence and the fights and the guns and everything that is happening in the streets of Lebanon today. They're not allowing anything to happen because they want to make sure that Hezbollah comes back to something friendly. How do you mitigate that? The army and the parliament. These are your two keys. The army is the U.S. main ally in Lebanon, but the army cannot deploy without orders from the prime minister. And you cannot really eventually, after ceasefire, send the army to deploy in south of Litani and ask them to do their job without two things, without going through the streets in Lebanon and proving to the Shia that they are the state, efficient, authoritative, and protective. And then when they go to the south of Litani, which is mainly the Shia that are in the streets of Beirut today, how are you going to go and deploy where these people are living if you're not present today among them, telling them that no guns, no sectarian violence, but the state is here to protect you? You have to start doing it now. Otherwise, you cannot deploy in the army. The Shia community is not going to be friendly. But this needs the prime minister to order the Lebanese army to deploy. You have no other choice. The army needs to be there as a state. The only thing left of the state is the army. They have to go down the street, project authority, power, protection. The second thing is the parliament, and this is where Nabi Berri comes in.
By the way, just for our listeners, Nabi Berri is the Speaker of the Parliament, and he's been for decades one of the most dominant Shia politicians, and his Amal movement, right, has been working very closely with Hezbollah.
Correct. In the 80s, actually, he worked with the Israelis against Hezbollah, but that changed drastically. I think, no one should trust that Nabi Berri is going to do anything against Hezbollah. What I needed to say this before I say why. Nabi Berri has the key to the parliament, literally. Now is the opportunity to call for consecutive parliamentary sessions to elect a president and not leave without electing a president. And the parliamentarians are ready to do that. They're ready to go and do that. But you need Berri to convene the sessions. Berri cannot convene the sessions because he doesn't want to change anything, because this is the time for change and he doesn't want change, so he's refusing it. He feels safe and he feels capable of doing this because he thinks that the Americans and the Israeli like him. He thinks that they still want to work with him. But that's the most dangerous thing. At the end of the day, if he feels that sanctions are going to hit him or Israel is no longer giving him guarantees, he will open the parliament. At the end of the day, he is the key for the first step.
There's no way around Nabi Berri is what you're saying.
No way. He needs to be pushed and really, really pressured to do that. The border security is a matter of sovereignty. All border securities are a matter of sovereignty.
If you don't have control of your border, I mean, you're not a sovereign state in the classic sense.
Exactly. So any international resolution that needs to be implemented, whether 1701 or 1559 or 1680 or other anything, no matter what resolution you want to implement, if you don't have a sovereign state, it's useless. Violations will happen. You need a sovereign state. And now is the time. We cannot wait for a ceasefire to do that. The army, the parliament, president, government, new political class that might, at least might, with a lot of, uncertainty here, but at least you have to try to push for a new system that would actually begin some sort of discussion over Hezbollah's arms and make sure that the ministerial statement does not include the infamous equation of security of Lebanon as a matter of the people, the army, and the resistance. You need to drop this phrase from the ministerial statement.
So just to summarize, in your view, the pathway for Lebanon to restore its sovereignty is for the election of a president and then the bolstering of the Lebanese armed forces so it could deploy on its borders and take their country back from Hezbollah.
I'm not saying it's guaranteed. I'm not saying it's going to run smoothly, but at least if there's an opportunity here, you need to give it a shot.
Because others would say, well, look, Iran basically controls that country. The foreign minister recently visited Beirut. He will do whatever he can to thwart it so Iran will maintain its iron grip.
Yeah, of course. But Iran controlled this country through Hezbollah. And if Hezbollah is seriously weakened, Iran will have a problem.
That's the key point, that Iran has done it through its proxy, Hezbollah, and that the time has to be used. But again, the key is that it's a legitimate election, that it's supported by the international community, because anything that's going to be seen as somehow Israel-related, they're going to think it's a mu'amara, right, a conspiracy, etc. What role can the international system play to give Lebanon back their country?
I remember the only successful moment in the recent history of Lebanon is that when the internal and the external work together towards the same goal. And that moment was 2005 Cedar Revolution, when the U.S. and the activists on the ground and the political March 14, whatever, it's not there anymore. I'm not calling to reform March 14.
Again, for our listeners, that's what kicked the Syrians out. And there was like 1 million people in the streets or something. It was an incredible thing, the Cedar Revolution.
So it started with the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri. This was a moment when the outside and the inside worked together, and it worked. It didn't last long because of Hezbollah, but now we don't have that Hezbollah anymore. You could start with the parliament pressuring Berri, pressuring Miati to deploy the army, using all the leverage that the U.S. have in order to push for that. And then the inside can take care of itself. But they need the reassurance they got in 2005. They need the reassurance of the West, of the international community, that they're going to be there for them. Not in 2019 when they went to the streets and suddenly everybody left them on their own. It's very important to do that. And, everybody feels today in Lebanon that the political Maronism, السياسية المارونية, the Christian leadership in Lebanon ended with the assassination of Bashir Jmayil of the Kataib. The end of the political Sunnism ended with the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri, and it's true. And now people feel that political Shi'ism ended with the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, and this is seriously the end of that kind of Shiite legitimacy for Iran in Lebanon, and that's why I see this an opportunity.
And do you see the international system? Because, nothing could happen to the Security Council. It seems when China and Russia have vetoes, given their relationship with the Iranians, but U.S. leadership with France, maybe with a few other core European and Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, do you see them coming together and to seizing the moment?
I don't see it happening now. I see a change in perspective in the U.S. in the sense like there is an opportunity, there is a moment. I see a change in perspective in Saudi Arabia in the sense like, maybe things can change. I don't see a change in perspective with the French. They haven't really seen the big changes. There's a difference between looking at this with an idea of, yes, this is a good time, but actually deciding to use all your leverage to push for change. I see the change in perspective, but I don't really see the change in terms of really going out of your way to use your leverage in Lebanon. That hasn't happened. I haven't seen the push yet.
So we will see if we do see the push now, and if the moment is seized for Lebanon, that maybe it's once in a generation, and maybe we're at that moment. We'll just have to see. And I just want to thank you, Hanin, in lending us your time and your expertise and perspective and really understanding this very crucial moment that Lebanon is in.
Thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Hanin, for joining us today on Decision Points. It was a delight to have you. And now I'm going to continue the conversation with my colleague, Matt Levitt. Welcome to Decision Points.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You've been following Hezbollah for decades. You've seen all these different conflicts, wars, 2006. Now, how would you assess how badly Hezbollah has been hit once its leadership seems to have been decapitated at the top? Can it recover?
This is not a decapitation. A decapitation is where you remove the leader or a couple of leaders from the organization. This is open heart surgery. The losses Hezbollah has experienced are compounding. So first, there is the loss of Hassan Nasrallah himself, but below him, several members of the Jihad Council, Hezbollah's highest military body, including people who were involved in Hezbollah activities from the very beginning, the early 1980s, including the Beirut bombings that targeted Americans, Fuad Shukr, Ibrahim Aqil. I know of people in the U.S. government's current or former who are doing a jig because these were the guys responsible, along with Imad Mughniya and Mustafa Badruddin, for the deaths of a whole bunch of CIA folk, for example. And it's the second tier and the third tier and the fourth tier. So the person who we believe was supposed to succeed Hassan Nasrallah, Hashim Safieddin, appears to be dead. The Israelis took out Mohammed Qasir, the head of the unit responsible for overseeing smuggling of weapons provided by Iran to Hezbollah, and now his deputy and replacement has been eliminated. So it's multiple tiers and it's multiple rounds. That has a completely destabilizing effect on the organization in terms of command and control in the moment. One of the reasons we think Hezbollah isn't shooting as many rockets as everyone feared that it could, is not just that so many of the rockets have been taken out, we'll get to that in a second, but because there's a lack of command and control for people to say what to do, who to do, where to do, to coordinate it. The decision-making and command and control structures within Hezbollah have been destroyed. Many of those physical locations, headquarters have been destroyed, and the leaders, the people, have been taken out.
Hold on, just to be clear, when you say destroyed command and control, is this not something they could easily recover, patch together, and access the remaining half, which, I don't know, is that 75,000 rockets of 150,000?
Let's get to the rockets in just 1 second, right? Because aside from all these leaders that have been taken out, you also have a whole bunch of foot soldiers. Not only with the pager and walkie-talkie attacks, but don't forget that the Israelis have been responding to Hezbollah attacks for 12 months now, and they've not only been responding to the point of fire, the Israelis have been taking out Hezbollah personnel and key installations, especially along the blue line, the border between Lebanon and Israel, but beyond. Second is the rockets. The Israelis have done this, frankly, unbelievable job that I didn't think was possible in a very short period of time, taking out so much of Hezbollah's decision-making capability that it froze them for a moment and gave Israel just a few days to start targeting key weapon depots, separate from the launchers. Now, the New York Times reports that Israeli and American officials estimate that the Israelis have taken out as much as 50% of the rockets. Call me skeptical. But even if it's a quarter, it's a huge percentage of the rockets. If it's already 50%, you're still talking about Hezbollah having 60 to 100,000 projectiles of some type available. What the assumption is, or the hope is that within the body of weaponry that's been destroyed, the Israelis have been able to focus on the precision-guided missiles and the medium and long-range missiles, the ones that present the most strategic threat to Israel, as opposed to, for example, the Kornet anti-tank guided missile that they've been using so much over the past year, which has a range of 10 kilometers, or the Barkhan mortar, which has a very large warhead but can go just a few kilometers. So you have these two levels of the leadership and the key weaponry, and then the third level is acting to remove the other threat, which is the Operation Seize the Galilee that Hezbollah has been talking about for a long time. And as the Israelis have gone in, even they've been surprised at the extent of forward-positioned weaponry, tunnels, trenches, storerooms that Hezbollah built in houses, between different underground storage locations. And all of this is being destroyed, setting Hezbollah back very significantly in terms of their ability to attack Israel. What isn't clear is overall how much damage Hezbollah as an organization will suffer to the point of not being what it was 2 weeks ago in Lebanon. Hezbollah as a threat to Israel, that Hezbollah that existed 2 weeks ago, it no longer exists.
If you had to predict what Iran is trying to do to restore things, we heard stories of like 2 cargo planes were denied entry into Lebanon by Israel, it sounds like, and they turned around. But they're going to keep trying to smuggle in weapons to restore this proxy. I mean, they are the jewel of Iran's crown, isn't that right?
Absolutely. When it comes to not only Hezbollah, but Hamas, and for that matter, other Iranian proxies, elements of what they call their axis of resistance, like the Houthis, the next stage, as the dust settles from this year already of war, is what not just Israel, but the rest of the international community, specifically the United States and the Europeans, and our Gulf allies, are willing to do to make it much, much harder for Iran to be able to rearm and refund its proxies. We have just experienced over a year the consequence of buying calm by not doing much more, as all kinds of weapons were sent to Hamas and much, much more weapons and much more dangerous weapons to Hezbollah, and the kind of weapons that the Houthis have used to disrupt international shipping and supply chains. Without the Iranian weaponry and money, none of these groups would be anywhere near the threat they are. And you have to anticipate Iran is not going to just put up its hands and give up. They're going to try and find ways to smuggle these weapons in. They have a bigger challenge than they did before. Key people have been taken out. Hezbollah operational commander Mohammad Qusair, who was the chief person behind smuggling and overseeing the movement of Iranian weapons to Hezbollah, was so trusted, not just by Hezbollah, but by the Iranians, that when Assad of Syria was brought to Iran to meet with the supreme leader, to meet with Qasem Soleimani, it was Mohammad Qusair who was brought in to be the translator from Arabic to Farsi. He's gone. His replacement is gone. Their networks of smuggling are, in the moment, disrupted. The Israelis are being much more aggressive, as you mentioned, not only in signaling to the Iranians things like, if that plane lands in Beirut International Airport, we're going to blow it up, but also striking further into Syria and more regularly going so far as the Syrian-Iraqi border to carry out airstrikes to disrupt resupply efforts. Now, the Israelis will be the first to tell you they can't stop everything. And so we, the international community, are going to have to find the funds and the personnel to leverage within the intelligence community and the military community to be able to do much, much more to disrupt Iran's weapons smuggling, in particular funding as well, so that Hezbollah, Hamas can't rearm themselves, so that the Houthis can't continue to be the threat they were. But remember, if things stop soon, and there's reason to think they might, the U.S. certainly, I think, is going to want this wrapped up before the next president assumes office, not before the election, but by mid-January. The Israelis are actually saying, look, Hezbollah, you made a mistake hooking your wagon to Hamas and saying, well, you won't stop fighting, shooting rockets at Israel until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. Many people thought the Israelis wanted to delink that. The Israelis are actually going the opposite way now and saying, you know what, Hezbollah, you're so desperate for a ceasefire right now, you're not going to get a ceasefire if our hostages don't come home. What we have to anticipate is that, A, Hezbollah is still going to be able to use those rockets it has, and B, that Iran is going to try and complement that, resupply, and send a ton of money so that Hezbollah can rebuild the infrastructure that's been destroyed. That is what's happened in 2006, so we have precedent for it.
There's a lot of interest, of course, in the pager issue, and a lot has been written. It seemed to me that the pager intel looks like it came out of a Hollywood movie, is what forced the top tier to have to sit and meet together, and then they became vulnerable to an Israeli strike. Isn't that right?
Look, there's an element to that. Certainly, I think for the in-person meeting a day or so after the second strike against the walkie-talkies, the radios, where Ibrahim Akil, a member of the Jihad Council, was meeting with some 15 to 20 Radwan Special Forces commanders, and they were targeted. Purportedly, they were meeting to respond to the pager walkie-talkie strike with a cross-border raid of the type that the Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon is now making less likely. Hezbollah people would meet in person all the time. People meet with Nasrallah all the time, in part because he doesn't want to get on the phone. But they thought that meeting in the headquarter bunker, several floors underground beneath a residential building, would be safe. You mentioned 2006 before. Right? After 2006, we know that Hezbollah came to people and said, hey, how about one of our two construction companies, Jihad al-Binna or Al-Wa'ad, how about they rebuild your building? We'll do it at a discount. We get a couple of floors upstairs for our supporters. We get the basement levels. So Hezbollah, after 2006, actually leveraged the losses they incurred in that war to build even better infrastructure. We have to make sure that doesn't happen today. The second thing to say about the pager episode is that it's not like Nasrallah said back in February, hey, get off your cell phones, and they went to pagers. That actually did happen, but that's not what started all of this, right? You talked about this being out of a Hollywood thriller, I say a paperback novel. The reality is this is the type of thing that goes back a long time. After 2006, the Israelis were quite self-critical, commission of inquiry, about all the ways they didn't fight that war as well as they could have. They were also very open over the years about the fact that they were preparing for what they described as the Third Lebanon War. And they just went not, cyber, not high tech, and put together an operation that ended up enabling them to insert these devices into Hezbollah's supply chain. Now, they were originally intended not to be used until there was war, but apparently someone in Hezbollah found out about them and they used them a little bit earlier. It opened a different door that we now see playing out with a series of operations of different types that have really just ended the Hezbollah that we knew. There's still a Hezbollah threat, but it is not the same organization and it is not the same threat to Israel that it was a few weeks ago. The Hezbollah threat to Lebanon, I fear, still exists.
How long has Israel been able to reap intelligence gains from this whole pager, walkie-talkie system? I mean, has this enabled Israel to listen in for years on Hezbollah's deliberations, or is this something very, very recent?
Look, David, here's the true, honest-to-God answer. If I knew, I wouldn't tell you, and I don't know.
Okay, all right.
Clearly, this was not primarily a listen in. And I think there's maybe not necessarily the case that it was both. Maybe it was. But this was also something else. The Israelis have developed lots of ways to listen in clearly. In this case, what was the additional thing was that they were able to make these things go boom and take 2,000 to 3,000 fighters off the battlefield, not necessarily dead, but injured in the hands and in the face, and separate from the leadership losses, separate from the significant losses Hezbollah incurred over the previous 11 and a half months. These waves of personnel losses, and then the waves of loss of weaponry and loss of headquarters and facilities and loss of all the stuff they forward deployed to the south has really completely changed the nature of the threat Hezbollah poses to Israel. There still is a threat. They're firing rockets probably as you and I speak right now, last I saw, but it's not like the threat that Israelis faced 2 weeks ago.
So now let's talk about the future. And this is like a $64,000 question, which is Israel's doing these incursions now because it wants to clear out whatever weapons Hezbollah has in southern Lebanon and to make sure that it could legitimately tell its public it's safe to come back to their homes. At one point, the question is, Israel doesn't want to occupy that. And the more Israel is in southern Lebanon, Israel had been there, done that 1985 to 2000 because it wanted to stop rocket fire in Israel, but technology meant you could fire over the heads of the security zone, and Israel left in 2000. They're not going back there to stay. And also Hezbollah uses that long-term military presence as a way to whip up the Lebanese public opinion, saying there's a war against all of you, not just against us, Hezbollah. How do you deal with this catch-22? Israel just wants its people to be safe. It comes down to, can the LAF genuinely be capable of preventing Hezbollah from regrouping and intercepting its weaponry without allowing Israeli actions to be exploited against Israel? So how legit can the LAF be? Because you need both capacity, but you need will, too. Even if you have the numbers to deploy effectively on the Lebanese-Israeli border and on the Syrian-Lebanese border, they have to want to do it. They've been intimidated by Hezbollah in the past. The people who fire the shots call the shots. We wonder, is this a thing of the past? Can the Lebanese armed forces, maybe with UNIFIL together, make a difference? It's not like NATO is lining up saying, oh, we're willing to go on that border. I mean, you seem to have very limited options. What's your assessment?
All your listeners are my witnesses. You started off this question saying it's a $64,000 question. I'm sending you an invoice. Look, there are two ways to think about the issue of what the LAF can do next. I'm going to preempt it by saying, let's put UNIFIL in a box. Do not expect UNIFIL to solve your problem. UNIFIL is not going to take on anybody. And the big question, frankly, is going forward, are they able to still play, some would say, start to play a productive role in other ways, actually deploying and patrolling along the border without Hezbollah being able to stop them or intimidate them, which they've done? I think it was the Spanish contingent that brought drones down there. They deployed a couple, and then Hezbollah really kind of intimidated them, and those drones have been in the box since. But don't expect UNIFIL to take on any bad guys. That leaves the LAF and it leaves the Israelis. I certainly hope the Israelis don't stay. As you said, they read the book, they saw the movie, none of them ended well. First question is, what can LAF do in the south along the border? But before I answer that, there's a bigger question. Can the LAF, can the Lebanese government finally reassert sovereignty over this country? They've said for years, look, we can't do it. Hezbollah is too powerful. We can't fight them. They're better armed. They're better trained. They have more fighters. Someone else has to take on Hezbollah. The French weren't going to do it. The U.S. wasn't going to do it. It didn't happen. Well, the Israelis have done it, but to a certain extent. What the Israelis have done is severely degrade the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israel. Rockets, forward deployed stuff for a cross-border raid in the south. But Hezbollah is still going to have thousands of fighters. And they're still going to have plenty of small arms. And they will fight for their position in Lebanon as they begin and try to rebuild. They will not sit back and allow themselves to just easily be made irrelevant and pushed out. They will turn their guns on fellow Lebanese. And I do not anticipate that the Israelis will be able, or that it will be part of their mission, to try and blow up caches of AK-47s. And so what will happen is Israel will hopefully withdraw from southern Lebanon, will have succeeded in degrading the threat to Israel, will have succeeded in degrading Hezbollah's capabilities overall, but the one place Hezbollah will still be extremely aggressive and use whatever strength it has left, and that strength doesn't have to be rockets, it's just small arms, is within Lebanon. So I am more pessimistic than some that there is a tremendous opening here to sideline Hezbollah and get Lebanon to reassert sovereignty overall. I would love to be wrong. The second question is, short of that, can the LAF, now that Hezbollah is being severely defeated in the south and all the Hezbollah infrastructure is being blown up, a lot of it, by the way, targeted before the Israelis went in on the ground over the past 11 and a half months. It's now public that the Israelis had sent special forces in over some time to map this out, etc. Let's assume for the moment the one thing the Israelis successfully get out of this is that Hezbollah is not deployed right up to the border anymore. Whether that's under an enforced UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Again, who's going to do that enforcing? I don't have big hopes for that. But let's assume that there's a space. I really do think that there's an opportunity for the US and our European partners to communicate to the LAF, to the Lebanese government more broadly. We're not giving you all this aid that they're definitely going to ask for up front. But if you make commitments and you demonstrate that you will deploy across the border, yes, maybe together with UNIFIL, and you will not allow anybody who shows up and says, no, this is a closed military zone of some subnational group to stop you, then we will support you.
So a clear, explicit conditioning of aid to the LAF to enforcement.
Yes, if you will do the job you're saying you will do, if you will do the job that the weaponry and the salaries you're asking for will enable you to do, then yes, but enough of the half measures. We're not doing that anymore. And I think we should be willing to provide them support for the mission in the South if we can be convinced that they will do it, and that aid should be continued only if they demonstrate that they're doing it, even if, and I would estimate, even when they don't, or aren't able, or assess themselves not to be able, or are too afraid to take on Hezbollah across the country, At the end of the day, if the LAF will assert control over the borders of Lebanon, and in particular the southern border, that would be a step forward.
On that hopeful note, I want to thank you, Matt Levitt, for really helping us understand more deeply where things are at now and what are the possibilities going forward in Lebanon. I urge you to read Matt's update of his new book on Hezbollah and to listen to his podcast as well. So, Matt, thank you very much for joining us today on Decision Points.
Thanks, David. It's a pleasure to be here. The podcast is Breaking Hezbollah's Golden Rule, and keep listening to Decision Points. I do. Hope you do too.
Thank you very much. We've just had an in-depth conversation with two experts, Hanin and Matt Levitt, about the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah and the broader implications for Lebanon and the region. As we explored, Israel's recent operational successes have dealt significant blows to Hezbollah's leadership, creating both opportunity and uncertainty. Now, Israel is seeking to capitalize on Hezbollah's current weakness to ensure that its citizens who have been displaced for over a year now can return to the north and live in security. Yet there's a delicate balance between ensuring immediate safety and avoiding a drawn-out conflict or further escalation. One key takeaway from today's discussion is the complexity of ensuring long-term stability. Israel faces the challenge of securing its borders without being drawn into another protracted conflict in Lebanon. Hezbollah would love to portray an extended Israeli military presence in Lebanon as a war against Lebanon itself, the Lebanese people, rather than as a targeted campaign against this terrorist group. It's crucial that Israel does not play into Hezbollah's hands, avoiding moves that can fuel this narrative. At the same time, strengthening Lebanese state institutions is an imperative to ensure that this critical moment against Hezbollah is finally seized. But the reality remains, how this moment is handled could shape the security landscape for years to come. Ultimately, navigating this moment with care and precision could lay the groundwork for a more stable and peaceful future. Thank you to all of our listeners around the world for joining us on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rina Gaber, Simone Sadmeyer, Sidney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.